Your military service doesn't carry any weight here, Colonel." That's what Carolyn Peterson, our HOA president and self-proclaimed neighborhood tyrann, told my wife the day she returned from 8 months aboard the USS Harry S. Truman. Instead of being met with gratitude and a hero's welcome, Colonel Evelyn Reed was slapped with a $75 fine and a broken bar because our welcome home sign was 4 inches too tall. Caroline had no idea what she had just done. She thought her little clipboard gave her dominion over the whole street. What she didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with a decorated officer who commanded 300 sailors and held more authority than any cop in town. What followed next, let's just say it escalated quickly. That morning, I woke up before dawn, filled with a kind of joy I hadn't felt since the day I said I do. After months of grainy video calls and care packages, my wife was finally coming home. I'd spent weeks organizing the perfect homecoming, from deep cleaning every corner of our house to placing her favorite flowers right in the middle of the kitchen table. The night before, I'd stayed up late handcrafting a wooden welcome sign that read "Welcome Home Colonel," red in bold red, white, and blue. As I stepped outside to hang it, the neighborhood looked like a postcard from an American dream: perfectly trimmed lawns, neat flower beds, and flags gently waving in the early breeze. This was a place where military families should feel honored and celebrated, or so I believed. I double-checked my phone battery and made sure our security cameras were all active, via something told me I might want a record of this day. The countdown calendar on our fridge had been marking Eve's return for months, and now it was finally here. Even our neighbors were buzzing with excitement. Mrs. Patterson across the street had promised to keep an eye out for the Navy vehicle, and the elderly man who walked his dog each morning had asked me more than once when the Colonel was due back. I carefully positioned the sign right where Eve would see it as she turned down the street. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. At 11:30 sharp, a black Navy sedan rolled up to our curb. My heart raced. The rear door opened, and there she was, my wife, standing tall in full dress uniform, medals gleaming in the sunlight, rank insignia proudly displayed after 15 years of service. She looked powerful and graceful, her very presence demanding respect. She spotted me immediately, dropped her bag, and ran into my arms. We both cried as she whispered, "God, I missed home." I held her like I never wanted to let go. Neighbors peeked from porches and called out cheerful greetings. It felt like a scene from a movie, one of those rare moments where everything feels just right. I noticed Sarah, our next-door neighbor, watching from behind her curtain. There was admiration in her eyes, but also hesitation. At the time, I assumed she was just being considerate, giving us space. I had no idea what she was really thinking. Eve looked around, soaking in the peace of our street. "This is exactly what I dreamed about on those long nights at sea," she said softly. "Home, community, just being together." That's when Carolyn Peterson showed up and cast a long shadow over our perfect day. She marched out of her house armed with a clipboard, a tape measure, and her HOA president badge pinned like it was some military honor. She was in her early 60s, gray hair pulled tight, eyes like frost, ready to pounce on anything that didn't meet her standards. Without so much as a greeting, she stomped across the street like she owned it. Her voice was cold and sharp. "Hate to interrupt, but there's a serious code violation we need to address immediately." Clearly, she didn't hate it at all. Before we could speak, she was already measuring the welcome sign with almost surgical precision, mumbling to herself and scribbling on her clipboard. 4.22 inches over regulation height, section 12.3a of the HOA guidelines, she announced like she'd uncovered some felony. She turned her gaze to Eve, examining the uniform with barely concealed contempt. "This isn't a military installation, Mrs. Reed, or should I say Colonel," she said with air quotes that dripped sarcasm. "Around here, the only authority that matters is the homeowners association. These rules apply to everyone, no matter what their previous job was." The insult was sharp and unmistakably personal. I could feel my fists tightening, but Eve stayed calm, her military discipline shining through. I did notice, however, the subtle narrowing of her eyes. She was assessing Carolyn with the same clarity she used to brief missions. Caroline handed me a bright yellow citation notice, smug as ever. It was clear she enjoyed moments like these, tearing down others to feel important. Eve stepped forward with calm precision, her voice controlled but firm. "Of course, Mrs. Peterson," she said smoothly. "We'll make the necessary adjustments to stay within the community's regulations." It was a perfectly professional response, but I knew my wife well enough to recognize she had just mentally marked Carolyn as a problema, and Eve didn't let problems go unresolved. Eve was already mentally filing away Carolyn's behavior, observing her patterns with the same situational awareness she'd honed in hostile zones overseas. Carolyn, on the other hand, seemed oddly dissatisfied by Eve's calm and professional response, almost as if she'd been hoping for a confrontation as something loud and emotional that she could weaponize. "You have precisely 48 hours to fix this issue," she announced with stiff formality. "Welcome to civilian life, Colonel Reed." The way she dragged out the word civilian made it painfully clear she didn't view Eve's years of military service with respect. In her eyes, HOA rules held more weight than years of defending the country. As she marched away, clipboard now tucked tightly under her arm like a badge of superiority, I quietly tapped the record button on my phone. Something about her smug, authoritarian manner set off every internal alarm I had. I couldn't explain it, but I had the distinct feeling we'd want documented proof of this encounter. From across the street, Sarah's curtains shifted again. Her anxious expression flickered into view just long enough for me to catch it before she vanished once more into her house. It was as if the whole neighborhood had paused, holding its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. Eve's eyes followed Carolyn's retreat with razor-sharp focus the same way she'd tracked unpredictable movements in combat zones. That's when it hit me. Our joyful reunion had just turned into a low-key war we didn't fully understand yet. Later that night, Eve sat in the living room, surrounded by her awards and service medals. Her gaze lingered on one particular decoration, and I saw something I'd never seen before in uncertainty. The strong, composed officer who'd once led sailors through storms and enemy threats now looked quietly shaken. "What if she's right?" she whispered, almost afraid to say it out loud. "What if I don't belong here anymore?" Her voice, so often used to command attention and lead with confidence, now wavered in our quiet home. The question hung between us like a challenge to everything she'd fought for, everything we believed we were coming home to. 3 days later, at precisely 7 a.m., Carolyn struck again. This time, she arrived at our front door with what looked like professional-grade surveying tools and equipment more suited for a city inspection than a suburban checkup. Alongside her was a man she introduced as an HOA inspector. He looked nervous, unsure, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but also too timid to challenge Carolyn's authority. "We need to conduct a comprehensive property assessment," she said flatly, skipping greetings or any pretense of courtesy. "Your mailbox extends 2.1 inches into the sidewalk easement. That's a direct violation of both municipal and HOA policy." She handed me another bright yellow citation, another $75. Judging by the official language, you'd think we were being charged with a felony instead of a crooked mailbox. When I pushed back, telling her this was starting to look a lot like targeted harassment, her expression didn't even flicker. "This is simply standard enforcement, Mr. Reed," she said with artificial warmth. "Your wife, of all people, should understand the importance of structure and discipline in a well-functioning society." Eve stepped outside, still catching her breath from her morning workout, her posture casual but eyes sharp. She sized up the situation like she'd done 1,000 times before, reading body language, noting vocal tone, gauging physical distance. Even in running clothes, Eve carried herself with that innate command presence only a seasoned officer possesses, except, apparently, it had no effect on our HOA overlord. If anything, Carolyn seemed energized by Eve's appearance. "Colonel Reed," she said in a syrupy tone, emphasizing the title as if it were a parody, "I trust you'll handle this issue with the same precision and professionalism as you did in uniform." The insult was subtle, but unmistakably implying that leading military operations didn't quite prepare Eve for the real challenges of mailbox placement. Eve said nothing, but I saw her jaw tighten slightly, a clear signal she was done playing polite. 4 days passed, and just as Eve returned from a routine grocery trip, our driveway became the next battleground. Our SUV, packed with bags and bulk goods, hadn't even finished unloading before Caroline appeared, a tape measure already in hand. "Rear bumper extends 3 inches past the authorized driveway boundary," she announced triumphantly. You'd think she'd uncovered a smuggling ring. This time the fine was $150. The violation notice came with printed black and white photos from multiple angles, as if we were part of some surveillance operation. Eve questioned the seriousness of the infraction, and that's when the gloves came off. Mrs. Reed, Caroline said, voice dripping with forced civility, I've been extraordinarily tolerant during your family's adjustment period, but patience and full compliance are essential in a well-ordered civilian neighborhood. From behind her window, Sarah watched Hagana face pale, fingers wringing the edge of her curtains. She looked like she wanted to step in, say something, do something a broken bar, but she never did. Each time Caroline escalated, Sarah disappeared deeper into her house. I began to suspect she'd seen this exact kind of behavior before, and she knew how ugly it could get. Caroline was using the hoe as a weapon, intimidating anyone who threatened her sense of control. The neighborhood had grown silent under her rule. People avoided confrontation, avoided eye contact, avoided us. This wasn't just about a sign or a mailbox. This was about control, about power, about creating a neighborhood where fear kept people quiet. By day 12, what I had started calling our CGA, Caroline took things to a whole new level. This time, it was the porch light. We received a formal notice stating that our porch light violated dark sky community standards by producing glare that interfered with neighboring residents' night vision. It sounded like we were operating a stadium floodlight instead of a basic motion-activated porch lamp. The fine? $200. And the war was far from over. The porch light Caroline had targeted was nothing more than a simple decorative fixture, installed by the previous owners. When Eve pressed her for specifics, demanding to know which neighbor had lodged the complaint, Caroline's response oozed with smug satisfaction. Anonymous reports are fully permitted under HOA policy, Colonel Reed, she said, her grin barely concealed. Residents have the right to file complaints without fear of retaliation or intimidation from violators. It was clear she believed she built the perfect system, one where she could hide behind bylaws while targeting whomever she pleased, without ever having to name names. But Eve was no stranger to systems of control. Her military instincts had fully kicked in by this point, and she began approaching the situation like a reconnaissance mission. She documented every encounter, captured photos, and began building a timeline. Her notes were meticulous. She's using a strategy, Eve told me that night, spreading her collected evidence across the kitchen table. This isn't about upholding neighborhood rules. This is deliberate. It's sustained psychological pressure meant to wear us down. It was remarkable to watch the shift in my wife. The uncertainty and self-doubt that had shaken her just days earlier were giving way to something far more familiar, resolve. The same tactical focus that helped her lead naval missions was now being directed at our HOA president. Eve had come to a sobering conclusion that this wasn't really about signs, mailboxes, or porch lights. It was about control, about one woman's obsession with power. And Eve, with her strength and presence, had become the ultimate threat to that control. Exactly 15 days after our homecoming was derailed, the situation exploded. A certified letter arrived from the law office representing the HOA. Inside was a formal warning. They intended to place a lien on our property due to accumulated fines, which now totaled $525. The legal tone was sharp and threatening. If we didn't pay the full amount and agree to heightened oversight, they'd begin proceedings that could lead to foreclosure. As Eve read the letter, something inside her finally snapped. She stormed into the garage without a word and began pummeling her old punching bag with the kind of force I hadn't seen since her last deployment. Blow after blow, the heavy leather began to split, spilling sand across the floor. I spent 15 years defending this country's freedom, she shouted between strikes, and I'm not going to be bullied in my own neighborhood by a power-hungry bureaucrat with a clipboard. Later that night, I found her slumped on the floor beside the torn bag, exhausted physically and emotionally. Her shoulders were slumped, her face buried in her hands. I don't know if I belong in civilian life anymore, she whispered, her voice heavy with defeat. Maybe she's right. Maybe people like me just don't get how the real world works. It crushed me to hear her say that. This woman who had sacrificed so much, led so many, and stood so tall was being systematically torn down by someone who'd never served anyone but herself. As I helped her up from the floor, I made a silent vow. We would not let this continue. We would find a way to push back. The very next morning, fate brought an unexpected ally to our doorstep. Sarah, the neighbor who had watched silently from behind curtains for weeks, showed up clutching a thick manila folder. Her hands trembled, and her face was ghost pallid, but there was something else behind her eyes. Resolve. "Colonel Reed," she said, her voice barely audible, "there's something you need to know. Something about Carolyn. Something that's been happening for years." She stepped inside like she was sneaking into enemy territory, her eyes darting nervously toward the street, as if expecting Caroline to materialize and shut her down. She placed the folder on our kitchen table, opened it, and began spreading out the contents of documents, photos, citations, like an intelligence officer preparing a classified briefing. "I've been collecting evidence for 2 years," she began, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "It started when Carolyn destroyed my old neighbors. That's when I realized that someone needed to start keeping records." Inside the folder was a damning collection of material. Pictures, letters, HOA warnings, even police reports. It was all meticulously organized, clearly the result of months if not years of quiet investigation. "We're not the first," Sarah said, her hand resting on a stack of violation notices. "You're just the latest. She's done this before, to families like yours, military families." She flipped to a section labeled the Johnsons. The father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. They bought their home thinking it was a safe place to raise their kids. Sarah showed us photos, a proud, well-kept house gradually decaying into a neglected shell. "Caroline cited them every single day for 6 months. She said they couldn't keep up, they had to sell, took a huge financial hit. They left in silence, humiliated. The pattern was clear: select a target, apply relentless pressure, destroy them emotionally or financially, then claim it as a victory for the community." Sarah turned to the next case, Mrs. Wilson. "She had the most beautiful garden in the neighborhood, won awards for it." Then Carolyn started citing HERA 47 times. 47? Eve asked, stunned. "None of them were real violations," Sarah said. "Caroline just made up fake regulations. There were no rules against her lavender plants, no ordinance banning decorative rocks. She just wanted to break her spirit." But the most chilling story was still to come. Sarah leaned in, her voice now a whisper. "The Rodriguez family," she said. "That was the worst. Only a broken bar. The Rodriguez family was Navy, just like you," Sarah said, sliding another set of photos across the table. The father, a submarine commander with 2 decades in uniform, lasted only 4 months before Caroline forced them out. Her tactic? Target their teenage daughter. Anytime the girl waited for the school bus outside her own home, Caroline filed reports claiming she was loitering. From phony property violations, Caroline escalated to personal attacks to complaints to the school district, even bogus calls to Child Protective Services. Sarah's final revelation landed like a depth charge. "She goes after military families on purpose," she said, eyes flashing. "She thinks we act superior and need to be put in our place." The disgust in Sarah's voice made the motive clear. This was envy and resentment trapped in HOA bylaws. Eve pored over the evidence the way she'd study an intel's packet, arranging documents by date, highlighting patterns. One look at her notes and the strategy snapped into focus. Start with minor citations. Increase frequency and severity. Introduce legal threats. Bring in outside agencies, police, CPS, Endernia to finish the job. Financial statements in the folder showed HOA funds siphoned into miscellaneous expenses, legal retainers, surveillance gear, a private war chest. Sarah, who'd worked in accounting, shook her head. "The math is all wrong. She's funding personal vendettas with community money." That was all Eve needed. The uncertainty I'd seen in her days earlier burned away, replaced by decisive command mode. "No more waiting," she said. "We're taking this head-on." She laid out her full dress uniform, every ribbon, every medal polished to a mirror chignon and pinned on her colonel's insignia. The message was unmistakable: "You picked the wrong target." We walked to Carolyn's house like an advancing unit. I hung back, phone recording. Caroline opened the door, surprise flickering across her face before morphing into what looked disturbingly like eagerness. Eve spoke first, voice crisp and authoritative. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm Colonel Evelyn Reed, United States Navy. This harassment ends now." She offered her military ID as formally as if she were at a security checkpoint. Caroline's smile was razor thin. "A full Colin Lee, how impressive," she murmured, then her tone turned clinical. "Weaponized. I've read a great deal about deployment stress, anger issues, adjustment disorders, difficulty respecting civilian authority." A broken bar. Each phrase was a pinpoint strike at Eve's insecurities. "All it takes is one detailed phone call, Colonel, and your superiors will open an investigation into your fitness for command." The realization hit us both. Carolyn wasn't merely a petty tyrant, she was a calculated predator who'd researched how to dismantle a military career. She leaned in, voice dropping to a chilling whisper, "You have no idea what I'm capable of, but you're about to find out." The next morning, Carolyn launched what could only be described as a psychological operation, executed with the same precision as a strategic military campaign, except this one was aimed at crushing morale, not defending it. She began subtly, weaving whispers of concern into casual morning conversations with neighbors. With a warm, rehearsed smile, she expressed genuine worry about the poor military woman across the street, who seemed increasingly unstable since returning home. Her tone was soft, her phrasing careful at crafting the image of a concerned citizen rather than an antagonist with an agenda. It was diabolically clever. In just 2 days, she had seeded suspicion in a neighborhood that once respected and admired Eve. Her manipulation was so measured and falsely well-meaning that no one realized they were participating in a slow, strategic dismantling of someone's character. By week's end, Caroline had escalated and now reporting Eve to the police's non-emergency line. "I need to report a neighbor," she said with impeccable composure. "She's a military officer exhibiting erratic behavior, saying troubling things. It's becoming a community safety concern." Her voice was laced with just the right balance of fear and restraint to sound sincere. The words were chosen to trigger alarm while sounding responsible. She wasn't filing complaints as she was building a paper trail, brick by brick, creating a fiction that, without hard evidence to refute, would become harder and harder to disprove. Carolyn understood the system. She knew that when mental health and military background were mentioned in the same breath, authorities paid attention. She didn't need arrests or charges, just enough doubt to ruin a career. The sophistication of her tactics became undeniable when she started staging confrontations. Every move was calculated. During Eve's early morning jogs, Carolyn would appear on cue, clipboard in hand, pretending to oversee HOA business while delivering pointed jabs disguised as neighborly concern. "Still running from your problems, Colonel?" she would chirp, faux sympathy dripping from every word. "Or are you running toward them?" These encounters weren't spontaneous. Caroline had strategically installed security cameras angled just right to capture Eve's reactions while portraying herself as a frail, elderly woman harassed by an intimidating veteran. One morning, it all came to a head. Caroline intercepted Eve again, right as she finished a long workout, sweaty, exhausted, visibly tense. It was the perfect moment. "And what exactly are you trying to say, Mrs. Peterson?" Eve asked, clearly fed up after another round of thinly veiled insults about her mental fitness. "Oh, nothing at all, Colonel Reed," Carolyn replied, voice sugary sweet. "I'm simply voicing concern about your civilian readjustment issue and the possible impact on our peaceful neighborhood." Multiple cameras captured the entire exchange from carefully curated angles. The resulting footage could easily be manipulated into a story about an unhinged officer losing control. What made Carolyn's plot especially dangerous was her deep understanding of public perception around veterans. She'd studied it and knew how to twist community sympathy into suspicion. Her smear campaign wasn't gossip, it was a surgical strike, weaponizing the very goodwill meant to protect military families. Less than an hour after that final confrontation, police cruisers pulled up in front of our house. The official reason? Reports of a domestic disturbance involving a possibly unstable veteran. The dispatch record would later show that multiple calls had been carefully timed and worded to reinforce the false narrative. Sergeant Marcus Cole and Officer Martinez approached our property with calm professionalism, treating the situation with the gravity it deserved. They had been trained for this, a possible mental health crisis involving a trained military officer who might pose a serious threat. They found even the garage, drenched in sweat, mid-workout hammering her punching bag with the same raw intensity she used to release stress on deployment. The optics were devastating. Caroline had set the stage perfectly, an agitated veteran, caught mid-outburst, fitting every stereotype she'd been feeding the community and the police. As the officers assessed the scene, Caroline stepped into her well-practiced role as the frightened, caring neighbor trying to do the right thing. "Officers," she said, her voice tight with emotion but flawlessly controlled, "I'm honestly afraid for our safety. She's been making threats, lurking around my property, yelling things I don't understand. She needs help, real help." She handed over her evidence in a neatly compiled folder: photos, audio clips, timestamps, and incident summaries. The package was so thorough, so polished, that even seasoned law enforcement couldn't ignore it. Sergeant Cole approached Eve slowly, posture cautious but respectful. His right hand hovered just inches from his radio, ready for anything. The trap had been set, and now it was snapping shut. His fingers hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup if necessary. "Ma'am, we've received several reports regarding aggressive and threatening behavior toward your neighbors," Sergeant Cole began, his tone calm but firm. "We need to speak with you to better understand the situation." This was the moment Caroline had meticulously engineered, a one where the authorities treated Eve as a possible threat instead of a decorated officer who had served her country with honor. From a safe distance, Caroline observed like a predator awaiting its final kill, convinced she was about to watch her plan succeed. But what happened next caught her completely off guard. Instead of reacting with panic or defensiveness, Eve stopped mid-workout and stood tall, assuming the crisp, commanding posture of military attention. It was a sudden, stunning shift from sweating civilian to poised leader. "Sergeant," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I'm Colonel Evelyn Reed, United States Navy, USS Harry S. Truman. I am active duty. I respectfully request that you verify my identity and service record before making any assumptions about my conduct or mental state." The transformation was striking. In that instant, Eve reclaimed not just her authority, but the narrative itself. The image of a distraught civilian shattered, replaced by the commanding presence of a senior officer used to holding lives in her hands. Sergeant Cole's demeanor changed instantly. Recognition sparked in his eyes, a military recognizing military. "Colonel, ma'am," he said, nodding with newfound respect, "I apologize. I'm Sergeant Marcus Coley, 82nd Airborne, retired, 20 years of service." His entire approach shifted from guarded police procedure to respectful dialogue between veterans. Across the yard, Caroline's smirk faltered. For the first time, she showed real unease as her plan met resistance she hadn't anticipated. "Perhaps we should discuss this more appropriately," Marcus continued, "with full awareness of your service and standing in the military community." As he reviewed Eve's credentials and observed her composure, Caroline attempted a last-ditch power play, forcing a crooked smile as she tried to twist the knife. "Ask her about the incident report, Sergeant," she said, eyes glittering with malice. "Ask her why she really came home early from deployment. Was she bluffing, or did she know something real?" The stakes had just been raised. "But we were ready, Sergeant Cole." I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady. "I believe you'll want to see this." I pulled out my tablet and opened the folder I'd spent weeks compiling: audio files, incident records, photographs. It was all there, meticulously organized, a complete dossier chronicling Caroline's campaign from day one. The audio was sharp and unmistakably Caroline threatening Eve's career, mocking her military background, weaponizing HOA rules like a personal arsenal. Then came Sarah's folder: 2 years of documented abuse, timelines, police complaints, statements from 4 families who'd endured the same pattern of minor violations, escalated pressure, psychological manipulation until they were forced to sell and leave. Financial reports followed. Caroline had funneled home money into personal legal fees and questionable equipment purchases that had nothing to do with community maintenance. Sarah, once an accountant, had tracked every inconsistency. Eve's military expertise helped verify the implications. Sergeant Cole studied each piece with care, the weight of the information sinking in. "This is thorough," he said, visibly impressed. "Very thorough, and it tells a much different story than what we've heard from Mrs. Peterson." Caroline's composure cracked. Her voice rose in volume in desperation. "They're fabricating this. You're looking at obsessive behavior, paranoia. It's exactly what I reported to you." She tried to spin our meticulous evidence as further proof of instability. A delusional military officer, enabled by an equally unwell husband, she painted herself as a helpless widow under siege by a disturbed couple. "She's clearly suffering from PTSD," she insisted, her voice shaking with theatrical emotion. "And he's enabling her delusions. They're targeting me, an elderly woman just trying to uphold community standards." But her performance was brittle, transparent. Years of manipulation had made her confident, but not convincing, not in the face of overwhelming evidence and the steady professionalism of a Navy colonel who'd faced real threats and real war zones. Marcus had seen enough. He'd witnessed real trauma, real instability, and he knew what manipulation looked like when it masked itself as victimhood. Eve, calm and composed, radiated strength. Carolyn, on the other hand, had unraveled. And the audio evidence? It was about to make everything undeniable. The most damaging blow to Caroline's entire case came from her own voice-via recordings that captured her making threats, undermining her carefully crafted victim persona, and exposing a level of control and malice that no neighbor could ignore. Her words contradicted every claim she'd made, shifting her role from supposed target to undeniable aggressor. Eve's next move was pure strategic brilliance, the kind of decision-making that had earned her command positions in the Navy. Rather than wasting breath arguing with Caroline or pleading her case to officers who were still piecing things together, she pulled out her phone and made one call. "Military police," she said crisply. "This is Colonel Evelyn Reed. I'm reporting an ongoing campaign of civilian harassment that's directly impacting my ability to perform active duty. I need guidance on formal escalation procedures." This wasn't about dodging civilian accountability, it was about drawing a clear line in the sand. The moment Eve involved military law enforcement, she signaled to everyone that the matter had escalated beyond hope politics. She wasn't just a homeowner anymore, she was a senior officer defending her integrity against a coordinated campaign to dismantle her career. Sergeant Marcus Cole's posture stiffened. The weight of what he was witnessing clicked into place. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, turning toward Carolyn, "filing multiple false police reports is a serious offense. You could be facing felony charges and jail time." His voice had changed, no longer neutral or diplomatic, but firm and direct, the tone of a man who had seen justice twisted too many times. "Harassing active-duty military personnel," he continued, "especially with the kind of evidence we've seen today, is a matter taken very seriously by civilian and military law enforcement alike." The evidence was airtight audio recordings, years of documented complaints, financial irregularities. The scope of Carolyn's campaign was now undeniable, a multi-year operation to isolate, intimidate, and expel military families through psychological pressure and fabricated violations. The impact was immediate. News of the investigation swept through the neighborhood like wildfire. That evening, the HOA board called an emergency session. Caroline was removed from her position by unanimous vote, and a full audit of her financial and disciplinary history was launched. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years suddenly found their courage. One by one, they stepped forward with stories of threats, retaliation, and manipulation, accounts that matched our own down to the finest detail. Mrs. Patterson, from across the street, admitted she'd been warned not to associate with troublemakers like us. The elderly man with the golden retriever confessed he'd avoided welcoming Eve home out of fear of reprisal. With Caroline stripped of power, the community began to heal. Sarah was elected interim HOA president in a unanimous vote. Her first official act, immediate suspension of all fines and violations issued during Carolyn's tenure, pending a full legitimacy review. The audit that followed was damning. Thousands of dollars in HOA funds had been misappropriated and used to hire private investigators, pay legal fees connected to her personal vendettas, and buy surveillance equipment that had nothing to do with public safety. Sergeant Cole personally assured Eve the investigation would be thorough. False report charges were being prepared, and the district attorney had already taken an interest. As police vehicles pulled away that night and neighbors began to gather offering support, handshakes, and long overdue apologies, I saw something in Eve I hadn't seen in weeks. Peace. She stood tall again, not just as a Navy officer, but as a woman who had fought for her home and community and won. The same officer who once questioned whether she belonged in civilian life now understood her mission hadn't ended when she came home. It had only shifted because justice isn't reserved for battlefields. It belongs on quiet suburban streets, too. Before he left, Sergeant Cole approached one final time and offered Eve a sharp, respectful salute. "Colonel," he said, "you won't have any more problems in this neighborhood. That's a guarantee from me, and from this department." As Carolyn was led to a waiting patrol car for formal questioning, she turned to look back at USA not with guilt, but with cold calculation. There was no apology in her eyes, only the gleam of someone still plotting her next move. Cole met her gaze with a veteran's patience and a cop's authority. Hand on his cuffs, he issued one final warning. "Ma'am, you need to decide right now whether you want to make this easy or hard. Will Caroline confess or fight one last time? Drop your guess in the comments." 3 weeks later, our neighborhood looked completely different. Sarah's leadership brought real change, genuine community-building efforts, welcome baskets for new residents, and guidelines that protected property values without destroying people's lives. All of Carolyn's fines and citations were formally reversed. The HOA issued written apologies, alongside a public commitment to transparency and oversight. Every family driven out by Carolyn's tyranny received letters inviting them to return with guarantees that this time, they'd be safe. The new HOA leadership made one thing very clear: the abuse that military families and neighbors had suffered under Carolyn would never happen again. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt open, supportive, free from the shadow of clipboard tyranny. People no longer whispered their opinions or hesitated to lend a hand. A genuine sense of community had taken root. The criminal case against Carolyn moved swiftly, with overwhelming evidence, including false police reports, misused HOA funds, and the targeted harassment of protected groups. Prosecutors filed multiple felony charges. They called it one of the most egregious abuses of HOA power they'd ever seen. Her claims of being the true victim were torn apart by irrefutable evidence, voice recordings, financial documents, and dozens of witness statements exposing her as a manipulative predator. Her plea agreement included full restitution to her victims, mandatory community service with veteran support organizations, and a permanent ban from ever holding another HOA leadership position again. The outpouring of support for Eve was extraordinary. What should have been her welcome home months ago finally happened, this time organized by a grateful community. Local veterans groups honored her courage, not just for her military service, but for standing firm in the face of civilian hostility that had long gone unchecked. The story caught the attention of local media and soon became a symbol of how neighborhoods could stand up to abuse, especially when it targeted the very people who had served and sacrificed for their country. Sergeant Marcus Cole became a regular presence, checking in with residents and ensuring that the changes we'd fought for became permanent, not performative. Other military families from nearby communities started reaching out, sharing their own HOA horror stories, and thanking Eve for proving that pushback was possible. A new support network emerged of veterans, active duty service members, and civilians alike, united by the belief that communities thrive when they protect those who protect them. Through it all, Eve's leadership shone. Her ability to apply military precision and value accountability, integrity, resiliency to a civilian crisis made one thing clear: service members weren't a liability, they were an asset. Standing in our backyard one evening, watching kids laugh freely in the street and hearing neighbors chat across fences, Eve turned to me with a thoughtful smile. "You know what I missed most during deployment?" she asked, her eyes on the American flag fluttering in the evening breeze. "It wasn't the medals or the missions, it was this peace, the kind that comes from knowing people can live without fear, even from the small-minded tyrants who think a clipboard gives them power." That moment made everything we'd endured feel worth it. The final chapter came when we heard Caroline had quietly sold her home and left the state, hoping to outrun the damage to her reputation. But poetic justice had one more surprise in store. The new homeowners, a military family. The husband was an Air Force major who had specifically chosen our neighborhood because of the transformation and the story of the woman who had made it happen. When he stepped out of the moving truck in uniform, I realized Eve's battle had created something far bigger than a personal victory. She had helped build a legacy, a place where military families were truly welcome, where leadership meant service and not control, and where people protected each other instead of tearing one another down. Eve looked toward the house that had once symbolized Carolyn's petty reign and now promised a fresh start for a family committed to something greater. Turns out, some ranks are recognized everywhere, she said with a quiet smile, but real respect. That's earned by standing up for what's right, and no matter the uniform, no matter the title. Her words weren't just about military service. They applied to every neighbor who found the courage to speak out, to support one another, and to build a community that actually lived up to its name. As our new neighbors began settling in, hanging curtains, planting flowers, laughing with their kids, I couldn't help but think, this story might just inspire others out there. People who feel cornered by power-hungry board members or toxic neighborhood politics. People who just want to live in peace. Maybe now, they'll know they're not alone and that fighting back can change everything. If this story inspired you to stand up for yourself or others, share your own horror stories in the comments below. Because the truth is, we don't make this stuff up. Real people are just this wild. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next unbelievable episode of Ya Stories.